Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. And warmly welcome to this exciting 1-hour book launch on a book called A Citizen's Guide to the Rule of Law: Why We Need to Fight for the Most Precious Human Inventions of All Time. My name is Alexander Stubb, and I have the honor of running the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence. I'm currently sitting a little bit outside of Helsinki, and I think we're a wonderful group of polyglots all around, from Zurich to Fiesole to Florence to Paris to London. And Marta, I forgot where you are sitting. It does look wonderfully like Helsinki, but alas.
Well, the Zoom background is Budapest, and that's where I'm heading in a couple of hours.
Great. So we're in for an exciting hour talking about a brand new book of a very timely and important issue. I personally believe that if you are a believer in liberal democracy, you need a couple of fundamental elements and tenets to keep it going. One of them, from an administrative perspective, of course, the separation of powers in a Lockean sense. But most importantly, you need the notion of rule of law. If you don't stand by the law, you're really left with nothing. In many ways, you can't have jungle democracy as liberal as we want to be. And the conversation today and the setup that we have is, we are going to talk about the book written by Adis Merdzanovic and Kalypso Nicolaidis, sorry for my pronunciation on one or the other. And we're going to start it with a conversation and a few points from Sarah Nouwen, from Othon Anastasakis, and from Marta Pardavi. And the way in which we set it up is that first, Sarah is going to give us a 2 to 3 minute summary of the book, which obviously doesn't do justice to the 172-page content. But nevertheless, she's going to do that. And then we move into 3 5-minute interventions from Othon, from Marta, and Sarah. And after that, we go into the responses coming from Adis and from Kalypso. And we're more than glad to take questions from the audience. So please put them in the chat, and I'll try to take them a little bit towards the end of the conversation. But first of all, Sarah, you're the lawyer. What the hell is this all about?
Well, precisely. I think the rule of law has not been blessed with its name, because when you think of rule, one thinks of rulers, rigidity, strictness. When you think of lawyers, you think of Shakespeare, who called for calling all of them, or killing all of them. It's just, lawyers are kind of people you don't want to be too close to very often. Concepts such as rights and constitutions, even though they've also been claimed by lawyers, generate much warmer feelings. And yet, in the book that brings us together today, Adis Merdzanovic and Kalypso Nicolaidis, 2 non-lawyers, argue that the rule of law is the most precious human invention of all time. So this is no ordinary book about the rule of law. Rechtsstaat, or état de droit, if one is allowed to use these 3 words in the same sentence, because, and here we immediately get to very woolly debates. According to some, the English, German, and French concepts actually stand for very different things. The book does recognize the relevance of Kant, Locke, and even Hobbes, and in more modern times, Dicey, Kelsen, von Moll, Bingham. But unlike theirs, this book on the rule of law is accessible to everyone. Indeed, it is one of those books that I can perfectly imagine on display in an airport bookshop. And I think Marta is right now in an airport lobby, and I would encourage her to go and check whether it is there. And as the subtitle indicates, it is a book for citizens. And personally, I actually think that is almost too limiting, because the appeal goes way beyond citizens, for non-citizens are often those most in need of protection of the rule of law. This book speaks in crystal clear language to all of us. And I would say that speaking is literally crystal clear to all of us. Now, let me share with you, and now I really get nervous because technology gets involved, but I'm going to try whether it is going to work. one voice that runs so clearly through the entire book. For only 10 seconds, I promise. Let me do share. Okay, there we go.
It's up to you. Yeah, you with the black trousers. You with the funny smile. I can see you.
Okay. Did that work?
It worked.
Good.
Or actually, the person's whose voice you heard, did it work? She's muted.
Okay, good. Anyway, so that worked. This voice is only the voice of one of the authors of the book. And one miracle to me is how these two authors got such a very clear, unified voice throughout the entire book. But I think this voice, which is actually here from the State of the Union play, performed and directed by the STG, the School of Transnational Governance at the EUI, in which Kalypso played a phenomenal role. Here she was the voice in that particular play, but the voice is equally clear in this book. And, you know, to quote from the book really speaks to us citizens in a way of, hey, you, wake up, the rule of law is at risk and we need to do something about it. So to quote from the beginning of the book, except for a few courageous and stubborn individuals and groups around the world, and I think Marta is one of them, we, the great silent majority of citizens and voters, share in the responsibility for the rule of law being threatened. It's about us. And then at the end of the book, without you, there will simply be no change. Or we, you and us, need to step up and take responsibilities. It is our time. Now here you really hear that same voice as from the play. And by the way, you can watch the entire play on YouTube. I strongly recommend it. Now the authors are also refreshingly self-reflective. For instance, consider this chapter as an introduction to the EU's rule of law efforts, even if we don't like to call it that, because introductions are rarely read with the carefulness they should be read. Or we could have had a few jokes here about differences between Germans, Frenchmen, and Britons, or between any of the different peoples in the Western Balkans, but we don't believe in national stereotypes and shall not include them here. So it's a wonderful, direct, authorial voice. It contains great allegories and references to popular culture. I haven't read another book on the rule of law that features John Lennon, Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars, and Idris Elba, or a footnote asking for Elba's contact details. By the way, in this book, you can also finally learn the truth about the EU regulation on Bambi bananas. Now, all of this makes the book accessible to everyone, which is a major achievement on what is and remains, as the authors also say, albeit in different terms, an essentially contested concept. Now, the title says it's a citizen's guide, but don't make that let you think that it is a manual for your computer or a tourist guide which just gives some recommendations that you could or could not follow. This is a political call for action, or as the authors write, we are missionaries in the truest sense of the word. The book is focused on the rule of law in Europe, and in particular how the rule of law is a requirement for EU accession, and how the EU then struggles to monitor it once states have acceded. But as I will actually put in my own personal remarks at the end, when the chair gives me the floor for those comments, many of the lessons of this book should also be applied in EU rule promotion activities way beyond the Western Balkans. The case study of this book. Now, what's the book's argument? I often find that the best table of contents is a table of contents that's like a spinal cord. You read the table of contents you know the argument of the book. It holds it all together. So now I'm going to try to share with you, and I promise that's the last time, the table of contents. And let's just look at it and we see the argument of the book. So first, it's the rule of law, stupid. This book is about the rule of law, obvious. Saving the rule of law. The rule of law is, what is it, of course, and then why is it being threatened? And we will be called to action in this book. Then we see the focus on the rule of law in the context of EU accession and the focus on the Western Balkans. Then we see how the rule of law has been promoting, how the EU has been promoting the rule of law. And we see the fundamental dilemma of EU rule of law promotion. What has been going wrong? And here we see the problems, problem 1, 2, and 3. Then we may see the fundamental argument that this book makes. And that argument seems to be contradictory, but actually the author set out very clearly that it's not. On the one hand, they say that the EU should be much more ambitious when it's promoting the rule of law. On the other hand, it says the EU should be much more humble. And it clearly identifies in which areas it should be more ambitious and in which areas it should be more humble. And then, and I think that for people who are associated with policy schools, this is absolutely terrific. They come up with an alternative. How then should it be done? And then they come up with their alternative conceptions. And of course, a very clear, crystal clear conclusion at the end. Okay, I stopped sharing my screen. I also stopped talking and hand back the floor to the chair.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. If it was up to me, you would not only be at the law department, but you'd also be doing the marketing for the School of Transnational Governance, because I've never heard a better pitch for a book than what you did. It is clear that in the next edition, the name of the book will be changed from A Citizen's Guide to the Rule of Law, Why Bananas Are Yellow and Cucumbers Are Straight. So we expect this little twitch. A wonderful summary of the book and much appreciated. And I really like the spinal cord idea of the book as well. And when you see it like that, you go, okay, yeah, of course. The only thing I'm still wondering about is the key bono, but I'm sure Kalypso and Addis are gonna fill us in on that. So let's start with Othon, Anastasakis. What do you think of the book, and why is it important? What was your gut reaction to the book? What would be your questions?
Well, for me, the first reaction is that I'm commenting on two great friends, because I know them both very, very well. I know how they think in the Sisok's longue durée. And as I was reading the book, I was thinking, this is what Addis wrote, this is what Kalypso wrote, this is what Kalypso added to Addis's points, and this is what Addis added to Kalypso's points. I know them that well, and I'm really, really very proud of that.
Who did the bono? Who do you think did the bono thing?
That is Kalypso. So then we've got, for me, absolutely no doubt, this is an excellent book, which I read, and it really was really absorbing, but at the same time, in some parts with a smile on my face, because there are some interesting metaphors and jokes, and that kind of makes that discussion of the rule of law pleasing, but also amenable to everybody to read. So I would like to congratulate them, because this is a book which is at the same time, apart from jokes, it's conceptually, analytically, empirically, very solid, and at the same time, what needs to be done. This is what Kalypso and Addis and I always used to do in our brainstorming meetings. Our last session was always, what is to be done? And I really like the fact that this is from a citizen's perspective, because this is exactly what the rule of law is about. Having said that, the book does deal with a macro perspective as well, the bigger picture, how the EU relates to countries. But let me just say here, it's not just about Hungary, Poland, Serbia, the usual suspects. It's also about Western countries as well. You don't need me to tell you what's going on here, in the UK with Boris Johnson. If you read the newspapers, how you see issues of corruption, lobbying, and other issues are being actually in the news. That is my little, little tantrum about Brexit. But the picture is actually not very happy in this country either. Not even in the European Commission, because we remember in the 1990s, they went through their own rule of law problems, which they tried to fix afterwards as much as they could. So the issue in that book, as I was reading it, is first of all a matter of trust at all different levels, how the EU relates to countries, or countries relate to the EU, or how citizens relate to the national governments, or how they relate to the EU, is actually a matter of trust. This is the kind of the prime issue that connects all these cases, and how in cases of problematic rule of law, we also have a problematic trust. And then the other theme, obviously, that Kalypso is very keen on from her earlier writings, is that promise versus performance. So we've got that kind of promise Is it the EU? Is it the way that we think of the rule of law? We all know what the rule of law should be, but in reality, the performance is actually not very good. And that comes out in the book. Now, who is to blame? This is the first question that always need to be asked. And I think that the authors actually answer very well in the sense that European Union, in that it is focused on means rather than ends. It is also the political elites, but then it's also the responsibility of citizens as well. What I would like to add here is not just about the citizens have to protect rule of law. Sometimes they are the problem actually to the adoption of rule of law reform, because in some ways they are also quite complacent about things, and their way of doing things is actually threatened. And besides, governments would go for reforms in this area if the citizens wanted them to. So my question, while I was, reading that issue of who's to blame, I thought of the Greek case that Kalypso knows very well, and the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Theodoros Pangalos, who's during the beginning of the crisis, he said that we are all to blame. Now, that didn't go down very well in the Greek society, as you can imagine, thinking of the depth of the crisis. But what he meant actually is that we were all in this together. We, all of us, had a certain agreement, because at the heart of the Greek crisis was a rule of law problem. And you know what? It was actually a rule of law problem when the sibling democracy was working. So there is that interesting discrepancy here. And then we go to how important is the rule of law, which is mentioned in the book. And I kept on thinking about Paddy Ashdown, because Paddy Ashdown was the High Representative in Bosnia, but he was also a very good CISOC's friend. And before he went to Bosnia, Kalypso remembers that very, very well, we invited him to Oxford in a brainstorming meeting in order to give ideas about what's happening in the countries. And Paddy Ashdown kept on saying that from that meeting in 2002, what really stuck with him was the importance of the rule of law when he went to Bosnia. And then when he came back from Bosnia, again in another brainstorming meeting, he told us what? He said, I went with that idea of rule of law, but it was so difficult to change the chips in the minds of people, which actually takes us to that socio-cultural element that Kalypso and Avis are so nicely put. How do you change the DNA, as they put it in the book? And then my question is, are we asking too much from the European Union? Can the European Union really change the DNA in matters that are really social, societal, and cultural? After all, education, culture, these are very much, the national prerogative. So how can, the EU be successful in that respect? And obviously, one other thing that I was thinking, as well, and maybe it needed a little bit more, is the issue of punishment, because DNA obviously is something that you need to convince yourself to own the change and like it, but at the same time, if you don't have the stick, you're not going to do it. I'm thinking of myself, for instance, when driving in London and when driving in Athens. I'm a different person, I have to tell you. Why? There is actually punishment there for me, and and a penalty to pay. And my final point in this, what is to be done, I so fully agree in that citizen's perspective, because after all, it's not about the big cases that we all read in the newspaper, but it is about the everyday life of citizens, the relationship with courts, the relationship with, with the police. And I also like the definition, which is about protecting citizens from arbitrary power and majoritarian tyrannies, not in the political and the government sense, but in the everyday lives of people who are actually much more in weaker positions. And it's not just about justice and rule of law, but it's also about social justice. So I think that, you really nail the right points. And what I would like to finish with is maybe we could have, and that's what, this book actually made me think of, real stories of people. For instance, in the boxes of your book, apart from all these fantastic, kind of narratives that you put, maybe stories of people will actually be very representative. The problems that they face in their everyday life, because this is what we need to act a little bit as anthropologists as well in that area of the rule of law. And my question the final question that I would like to have to both of you, are there any successful experiences that we can look both in the West but also in the East, especially with this kind of accession process that we can, emulate. We don't always need to invent the wheel, but we can look at the successful case. With that, I would like to congratulate you, both my good friends. This book is actually timeless and relevant for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Othon, as well. And this is Addis and Kalypso. It's not a bad start. 2 raving reviews already, with a little bit of a disclaimer from Othon. And of course, because we're dealing with the rule of law, we want every participant to understand and know that at the School for Transnational Governance, there are no brown envelopes circulating for accolades on books. So these are neutral observations that we have in this Oxford-style conversation. Otis, I can't resist. You mentioned the name Pangalos. 2 memories from Pangalos. Number 1, Greek presidency, early 1990s, final stage of the Finnish accession negotiations. He was no softie, but what I give him, one of the best radio interviews ever, he said that George Papakonstantinou is probably the best finance minister that Greece has ever had. And I fully agree. And not only because he works with us. So there you go. Next, Marta, all yours.
Thank you, Alex. And I'd also like to congratulate Addis and Kalypso on this book. I really like the idea that Sarah brought in about airport bookstores. I'm right now at Frankfurt Airport, and I will check if there's any book in the airport shops that would deal with rule of law. You find all sorts of basic needs met at airport shops. You can buy chocolate, you can buy water, you can buy pens, you can buy Kleenex. But is there anything that would tell you about such a, not only as you say, it's the most important human invention in all time, but something that I would say is just as basic as all these other needs that we have for food and security. And in fact, I think the rule of law is part of should be construed as a part of our security. This is what keeps citizens safe. It protects us against unpredictable tyranny, and is something that not only protects us against arbitrary power, but it is a framework that should allow us to realize our different human desires and potentials. So it's a fundament that you can build on, and we can build diversity and cultures on that. But if we don't have a solid foundation for our house, and in this book we talk, or you talk mostly about the European Union and the accession process, but if we don't have a solid foundation, that house is going to crumble. And so it's a huge challenge that you've taken up. And I do hope that when the book is not only launched, but when you go on a book tour, it reaches as many citizens as possible. And for that, we discover, of course, that there's so many tools that can be deployed to actually reach people and to have a dialogue on something that is so basic, so important, and still so apparently obscure and complex. I'm a lawyer myself. I'm working at a Hungarian human rights organization. We've had to, discover how fundamental the rule of law is because of the rule of law breakdown and backsliding that we're facing in Hungary and Poland. But we also see the challenges of getting the idea out to citizens that this is so important to you. And so this is an enormous challenge, and it's very important that your book addresses this and it talks to people. The citizen-centered approach, which is of course more than just talking to citizens, is actually is something that I think is very important now in the EU itself, because so far the focus after a recognition has set in the European Union that we do have a rule of law problem in our own house. It's not only in our neighborhood, but it's within our own community that we have an issue. And so once this has been recognized, the focus on tackling this has been, of course, very institutional. But the EU is not only about institutions, but it's about communities and citizens. And so as a human rights defender, as a civil society person, of course, I'm very interested in how can citizens and civil society be brought on board and also become, valiant actors protecting the rule of law together with institutions. in the past few years, we've seen some ideas and there's policies being implemented. You talk about this in the book too, the rule of law monitoring mechanism. With all its faults and deficiencies, it's quite a new thing. So I think we should continue to push for making it better and to actually making it more accessible. And what you talk about in the book, proposing this living list of citizen-centered assessment criteria is something that I would be very interested to hear more about. How would this work in practice? How would this look like? What is the reporting system? Who is reporting to where? And, you know, from a very practical perspective, this breach-centered approach where people would be brought on board and participating in reporting breaches. Those would be, of course, probably individual breaches of rule of law, and that's a different matter, I think, than a systematic breach where we have rule of law backsliding. But this reporting system, what would it look like, and who are the actors who would be taking part in it? We already see quite a number of good examples around Europe, how NGOs are becoming more active in rule of law monitoring. Also, of course, academics themselves, the good lobby professors are exactly about this, but also another actor or group of actors that we perhaps don't consider as rule of law saviors are journalists. And I think it's really important to recognize the very strong link between freedom of the media and the rule of law, and not only in the crumbling and breaking down of these important values, but also on their interaction on how journalists are extremely crucial in detecting, monitoring, protecting the rule of law itself. So I would be interested in the further stages of the book tour in this reporting system. And I want to congratulate you again, and we'll certainly be talking about this living list with my own colleagues in civil society who are working on protecting the rule of law in Europe. So thank you again.
Very good, and thanks for bringing in the practical view and the concrete questions as well, which we'll come back to when Adis and Kalypso have a chance to respond. Let's now go to Sarah, who we got a flavor from in the beginning, and looking forward to your general comments and questions.
Thanks so much, Alex. So the one thing I would like to do is to illustrate why I think that core argument of this book has purchased way beyond the Western Balkans and actually European countries. And Othon already referred to England, or the United Kingdom, that it could be applicable there. And I actually want to take it to the area where I've done quite a lot of research, and that is in some African countries. And to see how it can apply there to EU and other Western countries' rule of law promotion efforts. And then at the end, I would like to end with 3 questions, pushing the authors kind of in areas where I thought, perhaps it's a bit more difficult, and these are the issues I'm struggling with. So I'll come with those 3. So, but first, what I really thought you convincingly do is to argue for this deep concept of the rule of law. And that goes against this anatomical approach. Okay, the rule of law is a set of laws, a set of institutions that actually has been driving a lot of rule of law promotion. And as a result, in a way, by focusing so much on all these laws and these institutions, training for the judiciary, change this act, we miss the wood for the trees. We miss actually what is so fundamental about the rule of law. And that is, as you, I think, convincingly argue, it's a political concept. Now, what I also think is really good that you do in the book is to differentiate between promoting the rule of law and adopting the acquis communautaire. Because if people get the impression that the rule of law is the acquis communautaire, then one can really start challenging the rule of law. You may not have to agree with everything in the acquis communautaire to subscribe to the idea of the rule of law. Now, what I then also like is how you move from this thick understanding of the rule of law to an ends-based definition of the rule of law rather than this means-based. So you first focus on what the problem is. Let's look, what is the problem in a particular country? And then what do we need to do? So as you write, if institutions can be reformed without affecting the rule of law, then changing these institutions should not necessarily be the prime focus of reform. And that comment really hit home. And let me try to illustrate why. So I've done a lot of work on the International Criminal Court. And everybody supporting the International Criminal Court always says, in order to end impunity, the first thing you need to do in your country is adopt legislation, adopting the crimes in the Rome Statute in your domestic law. And I would say that 80% of the NGO activism and energy goes into, reviewing laws, making sure that they get adopted, lobbying parliamentarians. But what is striking in some of the research I did in Uganda was that Uganda, for instance, had a War Crimes Act, the Geneva Conventions Act, since 1964. So the crimes had been on the book, at least in some contexts, since 1964. The real issue was the act had never, ever been applied. So then we can all start pushing for law reform, even though many of the crimes are actually already somewhere in the domestic law. The real issue is elsewhere, and we need to look, why is that act not being applied? Now, and you really focus in your book on the culture, and you just had a discussion also with Othon on the importance of culture. The one element with culture I always find we have to be very careful with is that it's not, oh, these people, from that particular area, they have this particular culture. It's not cultural in that sense. I think what we also should be looking is the political economy. So what pays and who benefits, who loses, of these particular, can people afford to comply with or to promote the rule of law? And that's particularly true, for instance, for judges and prosecutors. Now, and then the implication of all of this is then that, and I think that's the core message, you cannot leave the rule of law to lawyers. And I think that's absolutely right, both in identifying the problem and in also in searching for the solutions. And you have this very democratic approach, it should be citizens first. Now, let me then go to these three areas where I had some questions. The first one is about legal indeterminacy. What do you do with that? So you quote Bingham, questions of legal right and liability should ordinarily be resolved by application of the law and not the exercise of discretion. Okay, but the critics will tell you that even law has an element of discretion. Every rule has the rule and an exception. As a lawyer, do you apply the rule or do you apply the exception? And of course, some laws have more discretion than others, but there are choices there. Now, related to that, I think, is the debate between positivism and naturalism in your discussion. Like you have this discussion about the YouTube clips of Chief Justice Frank Caprio in Providence, who's dealing with traffic issues and who sometimes just doesn't apply the law because he thinks the law doesn't do justice. Now, I mean, you can say that that's right, we should all follow justice, but whose sense of justice is this? And isn't there also a danger that we're going for das gesundes Volksempfinden, what we all think, but is it really the case that we all think that? And one of the areas I think where this is currently quite visible is the discussion in the UK about taking down statutes. We can celebrate finally justice, statutes have been taken down. On the other hand, one can argue, well, there are legal processes and also democratic processes through which to do this. And is this kind of doing it yourself outside these normal processes? So which stance should we take? Should we go for the kind of more naturalist law or do we recognize that formalism, including positivism, can have a value? And that also question came up when in one of your recommendations, you say spoilers, whoever they are, need to be specifically named and targeted. But I would argue spoilers, can't they also be spoilers because they disagree politically? And isn't there a value in that? The second indeterminacy I struggle with is that of the rule of law itself. I mean, as you beautifully set out in this book, there's so many understandings of the rule of law, and you actually argue convincingly, it means that we should not be too rigid, we should be humble and recognize that there are all these different understandings of the rule of law. But what if different components of the rule of law are actually in tension? And I have one example in mind. So one of the key components of the rule of law is accountability. Accountability for the law, you can't get away with committing crimes, let alone with committing mass crimes. And this is, of course, again, my area of work. Now, that was the case in Uganda, where there was a lot of pressure to establish a war crimes court for crimes committed by the Lord's Resistance Army. That court had been, with a lot of donor money, including the EU, had been established. The only problem was that there was not a single defendant. Why not? Because Uganda had adopted an Amnesty Act already 20 years earlier, or 11 years earlier, and 26,000 people had benefited from that Amnesty Act. Now, that was, of course, a bit of an embarrassment for all that Western-funded war crimes court. So you got a lot of legal creativity, mostly inspired by so-called rule of law advisors, promoting the rule of law in the sense of accountability, who then argued, well, we'll argue a way that the amnesty doesn't apply. But as a result, the legal certainty in order to get one specific man, Thomas Coelho, on trial, in his specific case, they made an argument that the amnesty didn't apply. And that was, of course, great from the accountability perspective, but the legal certainty, which is also an element of the rule of law, of 26,000 people had been put at risk. And you do wonder, well, from that rule of law perspective, there's a huge problem here. And I was just struck by how easily rule of law advisors went for the accountability element of the rule of law and not for the kind of the legal certainty element. Now, the third question, and then I'll stop, is the question, which rule of law? I mean, in your book, it's very clear that you focus on the rule of law as a domestic issue, and you also use the phrase domestic agents like you. But I was wondering, what about the international and transnational rule of law? Could international efforts to promote the domestic rule of law actually be part and parcel of entrenching global unrule or the absence of the rule of law at the global sphere? And here, I mean, you in your book refer to Woodward's work on the ideology of failed states, showing how the designation of failed state was used by Western states and international development agencies to intervene in countries with policies that interveners thought desirable, but actually were pretty neo-colonial. And I wondered whether, I mean, some people have argued, let's put it that way, that the rule of law could do the same work. And here I'm referring to Laura Nader and Hugo Mattei's work, Plunder, when the rule of law is illegal. Now, they are mostly focused on rule by law, I think what you would call rule by law than rule of law. But the focus of the book is entirely on the mechanisms through which the transnational rule of law, as a deeply Western idea, has led incrementally to patterns of global plunder, a process initiated by the expansion of Euro-American society worldwide and now continued by nations, in particular the USA and multinational corporate entities, independent of political or military colonialism. So I'm not saying that this book should also have dealt with it, but for me, it's kind of the big questions in the background of anything that goes about promoting the rule of law. So it's a call for critically studying rule of law promotion as you do.
Very good. Thank you for those comments and questions, where I think we've been looking at the rule of law as a concept, both political and legal and philosophical. We've been looking at it from a national perspective, a European perspective, and now finally also from an international perspective. The couple of questions coming in to our audience, because this is such a lovely session, I hope you don't mind if we extend it a little bit to 10 minutes past the hour, so we have a good half an hour left. At this stage, I'll give the floor to Adis and Kalypso in the order that you desire.
I think
Adis
Kalypso
goes first.
Go first. Oh.
Kalypso was pointing at you.
No. Adis, you go first, please.
Okay.
Zurich before Paris.
Okay, that would be a first. Thank you very, very much to all three of you, and thank you, of course, Alex, for hosting us here at SDG and Othon, also for making this a co-sponsored event with CSOCs. It's always nice for me, particularly, to be back in these seminars and to have something actually to present here is always nice. When I think we started this book idea 3.5 years ago, I think, Kalypso, something around that. So it's been a long process, and we were somehow at times rather overwhelmed with certain developments that happen, not only the pandemic, but also certain political things that made it necessary to adjust our arguments. So we are very, very happy to finally being able to present this book in a form, and we thank you very, very much for these wonderful comments, particularly Sarah, who did a brilliant job, not only in marketing terms of summarizing it, and who managed to do something that I never thought possible, even finding and reading the Idris Elba footnote, which was a pure joke added into that we would like to have the contact details of Idris Elba to make this a movie, because we tried really to make this book accessible to citizens and non-citizens alike, and we are glad to see that that we have had the desired effect. Now, let me come to the questions which you raised, which are really, really pertinent to this entire discussion. And I'm not sure we can give full answers to all of them, or in the depth that would necessitate us to really that would be necessary to really give those answers, because whenever you present a book, you have to somehow pretend to take all these comments in, but the book is already written. So that's a disadvantage we face. So I'm taking your questions rather to as a starting point of where the future discussions could go, rather than what can be changed at this particular juncture. Othon, you asked us the very first question: are we asking too much of the European Union? And this also came in Sarah's last comments there, when there was like, how much international intervention is necessary in these states, and can we all delegate this to the European Union? As you know, I've done a lot of my work on the Western Balkans, in particularly Bosnia, and where we had a full international interventionist policy going on there. And when the High Representative stopped intervening after those Paddy Ashdown years, in about the when he left the office mid 2000s, then we had this shift to the European Union. Now the European Union should use soft power and stuff like that to promote the rule of law, and that's also where the idea of punishment comes in. I believe that that the best way forward is actually a sandwich tactic. You need the pressure from above. You need the agreement on certain principles, and particularly with reference to the Western Balkans, the rule of law principles themselves are not foreign. They have signed that you can find antecedents to the main ideas in this legislative text that were there before the conflict broke out, and those countries have also signed up to the Council of Europe, to the European Human Rights Charter, and so on. So there is actually a basic fundamental basis for the rule of law, which also allows us for outsiders to intervene and push those countries on these issues. But the problem is, of course, that when those countries have rule of law problems themselves, it kind of makes it a bit less convincing. If you have the same things going on in the European Union to say to the Western Balkan states, you cannot do X, Y, Z, even though it is happening in the European Union as well. So I think there needs to be, and that's what we meant by these spoilers should be named. I mean, the idea is that there are people who willfully obstruct the rule of law, the implementation of the rule of law. And the European Union has been rather diplomatic about them, and it's a common wisdom among the policy community in the Western Balkans that those spoilers should actually be named. That it should be said, this politician does not do what should be done, even though he or she promises it to be done. So that's one aspect of this debate that I think it's really important how we meant it. Of course, you have different legal to Sarah's point, different legal standards that are deliberately maybe set up. So, but then again, the rule of law is not something fixed, especially if you bring in this societal element into it. It's always a continued negotiations. You know, if you remember Ernst Renan, who said nationality is a continued plebiscite. If the country chooses tomorrow not to be a nation anymore, it ceases to exist. And I think with the rule of law, and that's really what we wanted to push for, and why we also blame the citizens or all of us for not paying enough attention, is that we need this sandwich function. We need the pressure from below and the pressure from above. And there are certain arguments that say, for example, that in these communitarian societies, you cannot introduce a liberal concept such as the rule of law. And that is the culture point, maybe in a different form. But if you actually go down and not go down, if you look at it from a citizen-centric perspective, and you see this is what the rule of law does, this is what should happen if the rule of law is followed, this is why you should feel obliged to follow the rule of law, and so as to make sure that tomorrow it is there to protect you as well. If you break it down in these kinds of arguments, then even within this concept of communitarianism, the rule of law becomes really something that people would like to fight for, and that is really translatable rather than say staying at this level that many lawyers and political scientists and philosophers have discussed the rule of law. So that was one of our major attentions, but obviously we could go deeper. And I like Othon's idea of actually involving citizen stories there. We try to do it. There are some citizen stories, but of course, I mean, I'll leave it to Kalypso to explain a little bit more about the living list and how it would function in reality. But their citizen stories are also very, very important in this point, from this point of view. I think I'll stop there so as not to take too much time, and I'll hand over to Kalypso.
Kalypso, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone. And above all, thank you for potentially making us very rich, because if this becomes an airport book, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Marta. We'll have achieved it. But and in fact, it's a great metaphor for what we're trying to do. I hope that it is accessible the way you say. And I have to say that in terms of the voices, it's been one of the great pleasures of knowing and working together with Addis that, you know, we just love to exchange jokes. So you ask whose voice, Sarah? Well, I give you a hint. You know, when it's a good Balkan joke, it's Addis. When it's a bad Greek joke, it's me. But another hint, you know, when it's really great singers like Alba, it's Addis, or fantastic films like Star Wars. And you know, these Balkan peoples, they like to ask for a job and get connections. So you know, you recognize who put that footnote in. Sorry, Addis, just a joke. 2 points really, because I'd love to continue the conversation. But one is on diagnosis, and the other is kind of what is to be done, building on what Addis just said. I mean, I say 2 points, but I mean, inside the point are 2 points. Diagnosis, I feel like in terms of scope, I was glad that both Othon and Marta, you know, picked up on the fact that yes, of course, it's about the Balkans and it's about enlargement fatigue and hunger in Poland, that whole story. But at the end of the day, one of the very key point of the book is that rule of law has to apply equally to all member states in the EU. And this is why the 2020 innovation rule of law reports that are for every country in the EU is so important in our view. And Marta, you picked it up. I mean, it is a key development. And it is because it's such a key development that we need to be critical about these reports that are very partial, that have their own problems. But this really breaks to a great extent the argument of the, you know, Hungary's of this world that says, well, you know, double standards and you're only pointing the fingers to, no, the EU is looking at everyone. But then it needs to do it and showing when there are big differences too. But in terms of extending the scope, Sarah, it was just wonderful that you know, showed us how you find it relevant for your work on Africa and Uganda. And indeed, I would just almost go one step further than you are, or something that you imply in what you say, which is also that we need not only to say, well, how does these stories that come from Europe, you know, apply to the rest of the world, but reversing the gaze. How does looking at what happens in countries where, as you studied it, we have big dilemmas of transitional justice, you know, how can that be relevant to Europe? And specifically the point you make about how transitional justice may call for less accountability, and we're very obsessed with accountability, but because it keeps in part from, it's also about, if not forgiving, forgetting, or and all of that is very, very interesting and important. And in you know, I guess I should say for La Petite Histoire, for me, a lot of this adventure started in the 2000 at EUI, when I participated in a project with Neil Walker and wrote with my wonderful doctoral student, Rachel Kleinfeld, who does amazing work in this field too, and worked on this field in her PhD and was part of the work that started all this. We wrote a piece called Can a Post-Colonial Power Promote the Rule of Law? You know, and exactly about this tension of whether it's not a kind of colonial story itself. And at the end of the day, it's not. But as usual, you want to ask under what conditions. And so all the questions you raised, Sarah, you know, on this diagnosis point, the last bit on diagnosis, is that when you ask about, well, legal indeterminacy, I hope this is what we stress in the second part, calling for being more humble. What does it really mean? What is X that you're trying to kind of promote? And to some extent, summarizing or my pitch on what you say, it's all about the status of discretion. How do we think about discretion? Because arbitrary power is, of course, what we're after. It's the kernel, it's the forest, not the tree. That is exactly what is the rule of law is after. But at the same time, the good discretion that is linked to diversity and pluralism and power exercised in ways that are flexible is what we're after, right? So, we need to kind of ask when is discretion good, when is it bad, just to summarize it in this way. And there's much more to say about this, but the plunder point is indeed can only be about self-reflectiveness. When we say the word rule of law, it doesn't allow us to do exactly the opposite in the name of the rule of law. And then to end on what is to be done, just a couple of points here. I mean, 3 points. One is, Othon raised the issue of, well, citizens, yes, but, and Addis was talking about the sandwich. I mean, I think we tend to answer that question by saying, well, external intervention has to be about empowering citizens, empowering the Martas of this world. And that's perhaps the right kind of interventionism, right? It's your business in your country, you own it domestically, but we empower you. But I think as important, the EU needs to refrain from disempowering citizens. For instance, right now in Bulgaria, citizens feel, and my friend Albina Azmanova, with whom we work a lot on this, we were discussing it only yesterday, citizens feel very disempowered by how lenient the EU has been in the verification mechanism. In cases where actually the checklist approach to the rule of law means that, what you really care about is the autonomy of the judiciary. But what if this judiciary, which is autonomous, is itself corrupt? No. And that speaks to the bigger point that we make, which is that at the end of the day, this is not about institutions, or not just about institutions. It's about power and structures of power. And if the EU is not interested in the structures of power in all of its member states, or when we look at the rule of law, then and that's Alex cui bono, because indeed where you stand on these structures of power and in this pyramid means you can benefit from breaches of the rule of law more or less, then that's the key, right? And so at Othon, you raised the issue of culture. So it's power and culture. And you really rightly ask, how can we do anything from the outside about culture? And here I kind of say, hey, our young people, students, they all connect. And Marta, works with many of her team is like 30. I think most of them, she's super young. Well, they're even younger than her. So you can kind of see, sorry, Marta, maybe this is not, and they're just amazing because they connect across, of course, every national culture is heterogeneous. There are all sorts of sensitivities in a country, but they're also porous. And that's where the hope lies. And that's where I think that sticks and carrots, Othon, are very important. So the Recovery Fund rule of law, which we only allude to in the book, is part of the hope, because that's going to create the kind of dynamic we would like. And that leads to an emulating across countries and conversations about what it means. And that leads me to the last point about the so-called living list. I don't even know if that's the best term, Marta. But yes, the idea, Othon, is to get a huge collection in my dream. Okay, this is my dream world, and Addis and my dream world. Is that you'd have a platform, maybe using the kind of technology that the Conference on the Future of Europe has on the platform today. And we talk about breaches of the rule of law. It's like oxygen. You know it when you don't have it. So the idea is that you've got this platform, and citizens, but also the good lobby profs, also your team, Marta, puts up lots of stories. And, so this is the breach that I encountered. And we've got keywords, we've got AI, etc. And people compare their stories. And you start having this very, very rich database of real stories. Some people will write it in a touching way, emotional way, whatever. but you build this database, and who's going to build it? Because if you build it, they will come. I like to cite movies too, Addis, you know. If who's going to build it? Perhaps the European Parliament, your institutions, but it will be networked and decentralized, but coordinated. You know, the skies are limits. So, you know, we've got to be all together in this, but I think this is one potential ways in which we can create citizen ownership of the rule of law.
Exactly, and if I just may add to that, we also, when we introduced this list, we also talk about the Pribe reports, you know, which happened to North Macedonia after it transpired that 20,000 people had been illegally listened to, and their conversations have had their conversations recorded, and then there was this one commission set up which had all the powers to talk to everybody, to investigate whatever they want, including journalists, including NGO representatives, and so on. So this would be a more institutionalized approach, but the idea is basically to open up the assessment framework for all these stories from below to enter our consciousness. And whether we do it with a platform or we do it in this more formalized, more institutionalized way, the idea is to empower, to change these, to go away from these checkbox ticking and so on, to go to something where you say this situation is different, so we need to look at this point at this other point, you know, and do this with some like regularity and allowing all voices to be heard and all voices to also engage in conversation with each other. That would be the ideal scenario. Sorry.
No, very good. Thank you very much, and thanks for the questions and answers and the observations. Very interesting throughout. I have some good news for Addis and for Kalypso. I've gotten a message there from Adrienne saying that regarding the airport book bestseller, there's already good news. I just bought your book on Amazon and was told there are only 2 left in stock. So to all the participants, 30, 40 that we have online, attack. And I would go for Amazon.de, because otherwise, if it comes from the UK or the US, you end up paying different kinds of customs.
And
so
you can also order it via the publisher, by the way, just that they have enough in stock.
There you go. Now, I'll take one question here coming from the audience. It's from David Madden, and I find it interesting. There are many interesting ones as well. He says the word backsliding has been used, but some recent examples, Belarus diverting the Ryanair flight, the UK government apparently trying to ignore the Northern Ireland Protocol, are more egregious than that. It is as if the law simply does not exist. What can be done about that politically or legally? So there's this sense that, you know, anyone can overrule the law. And of course, we saw that during the Trump presidency and presidential decrees. But how would you take this one, Kalypso or Addis or anyone who feels like it?
Well, okay, this time Kalypso, you go first, and I can add something.
Well, indeed, we all, you know, have things to say about the, you know, Britain's relationship with the rule of law. And indeed that many British lawyers have been concerned with Britain backsliding on its commitments. That is true, and Othon said it at the beginning, and of course Sarah can and Marta as lawyers can comment better. But I would also say that we do want to keep in mind that distinction we make in the book that Sarah also stressed, rule by law versus rule of law. That, I mean, clearly you can, it's bad enough to go, it's bad to go back on your commitment to international law in this case. But I would be careful in equating this with saying that, you know, the rule of law that is fundamentally eroded in Britain. That those are two very different, you know, realms. They connect, but where, you know, you can still walk in Britain and not fear that you're going to be put in jail for no reasons, and that's not true in even some part of Europe. So I'll leave it at that. But you know, backsliding comes in many shapes and forms. It's a very complex thing, and it's not on a spectrum from 0 to 100.
Very good. And if I may, here in between, there's someone who calls himself or herself anonymous attendee who said, it would be great if we could see the questions, please. I answer, it would be great if we saw your names, please. Adis.
Yes, thank you very much for this question, David. I think both examples that you cite, the Belarus incident and the Northern Ireland Protocol, which are from the realm of international law, and that's something I quite distinctive. I mean, I studied international law back when I was at university, and it was a group made up of 50% were lawyers, 50% were political scientists, and the political scientists did usually better than the lawyers, because international law tends to be one of those laws where you don't have a final authority, you don't have a court that can actually decide and punish and all those things. So the solutions that you have to push forward are political rather than legal in this sense, even though I think with the Northern Ireland Protocol there is some mechanism of resolving those disputes. So I think in the international realm there needs to be a lot needs to be done, but it's a political discussion of all the usual political means. I agree with Kalypso that backsliding comes in different forms, and interesting enough, it can even occur even if the full extent of the rule of law has never been present. I mean, I would argue that the countries of the Western Balkans have been backsliding since about 10 years, even though they never reached a state where rule of law was fully established, you know, where you could say, okay, that's 100% and now they're backsliding. But even the slowing down of reforms and so on can be seen as backsliding. And here I think the pressure from below and from above, as I explained earlier, is the only way forward. Otherwise, I mean, we cannot leave these citizens alone from the outside, and we need to support them by empowering them, as Kalypso said earlier.
Excellent. And to our administrators, if you could somehow provide the questions and make them public, because the fun thing is that the anonymous comment came from Julie Adams, who is the administrator at CSOC. So there you go. A lot of lovely comments here. For instance, no questions from me, but I'm avid to read the book, blah, blah, blah. My own opinion is that the EU needs to be much tougher on breaches where they are found, for instance, in Hungary. It's a slope which steepens downwards. Now, the first question that came during the conversation, it's a rather long one, but it is linked to a thesis that the US is actually more of a victim of sophisticated state capture by a corrupt...
Us rather than the US, right?
Yeah, us, we the citizens.
Sorry, us, yes, us. I still always struggle with the we form in globally. Kalypso laughs at me on this, but she knows exactly what I mean. So R2R, a responsibility to intervene and protect also rests with international community, not only the EU, but also NATO, the UN, the OSCE, the OECD, among others. We, citizens and international community, need to be stronger collaboration. Citizens can win this fight on their own. Can I have your comments? And I also want to hear, you know, our commentators, especially Sarah, on responsibility to intervene or responsibility to protect. How is that linked to rule of law? Asks a silly former politician.
Oh, shall I jump? No, yeah, thanks,
Yeah.
Alex, for giving me the floor. Also, because of course I felt somewhat obliged in answer to the previous question to defend my profession.
Go for it.
Because, well, Alice says, well, you know, the political scientist is better. I think actually in answer to the question asked about the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Belarus incident, there are courts that can deal with this. And I think what matters from a rule of law perspective, that the response has been in both instances in the words of the law. So people haven't accepted that the law is irrelevant in these areas. They haven't accepted, oh, this is just power politics, there is no law. No, people have pointed out to the legal obligations and also to the possibilities about, or the opportunities provided by international law to do something about it. And if I may promote one particular blog, have a look at ejoltalk.org, because they're very interesting blog posts on precisely these two in these two areas. Now, how R2P relates to the rule of law. So the responsibility to protect is this doctrine adopted by the UN, that actually also weakened by the UN. So initially the argument was that the R2P should be that whenever the UN doesn't intervene, then states who should have the right to intervene in a particular state in order to prevent or to stop genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing. And that has been weakened by, I think in 2005, by the member states of the UN by saying the responsibility to protect is, of course, primarily with the state itself, but if the state doesn't act, then the international community, as represented by the UN, has that. So it's still back to the Security Council. So there is no, under international law, I would say, no right of unilateral use of force in order to save lives, etc. Now, I think the connection that you're asking about is that very often it's assumed that these crimes are committed more in countries where the rule of law is weak. Could be true. At the same time, it depends again also how you define the rule of law. I wouldn't, and also, you know, that's the thing. There is definitely a connection. At the same time, starting rule of law promotion would not necessarily immediately avoid these problems. But of course, rule of law promotion won't harm either. So I don't see a kind of immediate connection, but of course, in a bigger picture of issues, including the political context, I can of course see these things play hand in hand.
Very good. We're now unfortunately approaching the end of our time. I think we take it to 1:15, so 5 more minutes. If I could have a couple of final comments coming from the authors.
Well, I'll leave the last word to Addis, but I mean, I very much appreciated how, you know, our panel reflects the kind of what we are after. You know, a lawyer, Sarah, who, you know, speaks through our play, and tells us that the rule of law shouldn't be left to lawyers. So it's better coming from her than from us. But, you know, you demonstrate that lawyers can also speak that a language that is not just, I mean, that is universal in the best sense of, you know, pedagogical, but also universal beyond Europe. And yet stressing that we must be careful when we try to say this is a global conversation, because it's not one where the EU comes in and says, hey, world, we're doing this. We invented the rule of law. Well, that was in Britain, you know, whatever, Magna Carta, and now here are good words. No, but indeed it is a global conversation. And that last question is very much about all these interrelationships. When we say, you know, whereby the rule of law is not the same as an international liberal order that can sometimes involve, you know, domination and aggression, and without the self-reflectiveness of how what it means to support the rule of law in a way that itself is faithful to the rule of law. So I just wanted to note this. I also wanted to, you know, note that what we try to do with this book is also to kind of be a little tiny little support to the kind of work that Marta does, but also that is done all over the world. I mean, the network of citizens and citizens organizations working really hard, pretty much in the dark, very often in super difficult conditions, and oppression. And of course, we're talking inside Europe. We talked about Belarus, you know, our heart is there and in the neighborhood. Look at Algeria, what is Algeria going through now in the Maghreb? I mean, there is so many people, soldiers of the rule of law, you know, who are foot soldiers. And, you know, our book is a tiny little thing that we hope can kind of play its own small role if there is a need to make the case, as it were, for this oxygen of politics, you know. And finally, you know, to recognize Othon also, you know, we've at CSOC, Southeast European Studies at Oxford, we have for many, many years made the point that for all the attention to economics and macroeconomic stabilization, and we work with central banks and all that, this is the core of the matter. And enlargement is not going to happen until we crack this nut. And I simply want to finish by saying, you know, Alex, it's so wonderful you've been sharing this, because I think you and I and all our friends, you know, at STG share a belief that, you know, transnational politics is a politics where power meets values. And how do we make power meet value? And I've heard you speak about that, you know, often and in inspired ways as both a politician and an academic. So I really hope and believe that these issues of how we defend the rule of law as foot soldiers, as well as in the higher spheres of politics, the Addis sandwich theory is going to be very much part of, you know, the STG agenda too. So, I mean, I guess I'm not hiding the fact that I'm so happy that Oxford and UI have contributed in making this event happen, and with all the foot soldiers of our event itself, Fiona, Julie, Michaela. So that would be my closing words. Thank you to all.
Well, I can make it brief. I mean, thank you also from my side. It has been a really enriching conversation, and I'm really fascinated by in how many different ways this book can be read. And this is something that I was not anticipating, to be quite frankly, but I'm really, really happy to see that it speaks to all of you. And thank you again for these kind remarks. You know, I live in a Swiss municipality where there are certain people that challenge the local government regularly. Whenever the local government decides something, they reject, they oppose it, they even go to court. And 9 out of 10 times they lose, but this 10th time they're really happy and they see in their eyes justice done. And for me, this was always empowering those, as Kalypso says, not only the foot soldiers that on the more, on the really, really difficult conditions fight for the rule of law, even endangering their own lives, to which we as academics look in amazement and have a great deal of respect towards, but also these people that see that if you don't use your rights, they tend to erode. And that's something like, why is the rule of law important, why you should use it, and why you should always engage in this rather healthy activity of criticizing governments, municipalities, politicians, and so on. So our task was one of translating these bigger concepts to the everyday of citizens, be it in Switzerland, in the European Union, in the Western Balkans, or far beyond. And we hope to being able to contribute a little bit to their arsenal of arguments in this fight that they have before them. Thank you all for these wonderful comments and for taking the time, and thank you to everybody who came to listen to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Addis, as well. And with your last statement of, you know, criticizing politicians nowadays, I couldn't agree more with you. Before, I could have probably disagreed a little bit, but that's beyond. I think this has been a wonderful session, which has, I think, by definition, also been transnational. It's gone beyond borders. It's also gone beyond traditional borders of, say, departmental construction, because we've talked about politics, we've talked about law, we've looked at things from a value perspective. I've learned a lot and I really appreciate it. But I do want to leave you with an image, which I can't resist. I'll just show you what I have had right behind my iPad throughout this session. If I can switch my camera, it is one of our cats who has been quite comfortable in the typical plus 25 sunny weather that we have here in Finland. So here we go. She's sleeping right there. So with these ideas, I leave you and thank you all for a wonderful session, and wish you the best of evenings. And thank you very much to Michaela and to Fiona for doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes. Thanks a lot and have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Ciao.